Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 308, the Bellwitch case. Now this is something that a lot of you, if you like the paranormal, you've probably heard of it, the case of John Bell, Adams, Tennessee, back in the 1800s actually, and there being a fairly famous example of poltergeist activity. So I had read actually about this when I was a kid, and I can't remember, it was a book by Cohen, if I remember correctly. It was sort of a young adult paranormal compilation. It wasn't as deep, but it was fully sourced, a lot of interesting folklore. That's where I learned about the Beast of Gévaudan, some of these other creatures the first time. Little green men, the space goblins. And then, of course, the Bellwitch case. Now, in what I had read, I seem to recall that one of the tales had John Bell, before the poltergeist activity, which I'll get into, seeing like weird animals, like deformed bear-like animals, or giant birds and stuff like that. And then, of course, various rapping and poltergeist activity begins. And then this ghost, eventually, at first, just sort of attacking people or playing tricks. It becomes more violent, begins speaking, occasionally actually, or whistling, and it's considered to be very spooky. Supposedly poisoned John Bell in the end and ended up killing him, actually. But here's the problem. If you look at the actual story and the time frame in which it supposedly took place, the first time you get any particularly large-scale documented literature about it comes from many decades later and includes a lot of stuff that appears not to have been corroborated. Like, there was one story, and this was taken as being a true account, I think, up until fairly recently, because I'm pretty sure Cohen had mentioned this in his book as well, that Andrew Jackson had actually at one point visited the Bell farm, had become intrigued by this case, had heard about the poltergeist activity and said, I'll spend the night in the house, basically, because, he's old hickory and, he's, 6'3" or something, big stocky man, didn't care, and would just drink, beer all night and then leave. And then there's, of course, their wagon gets stuck, and the ghost was trying to keep away Andrew Jackson, and all of these other things. The problem is that the slew of various tales about it runs together, overlaps, it seems, with other poltergeist reports, and certainly with the Spiritist movement. I'll get into that briefly as well. When you're talking about knocking and rapping, you know what I mean. And it's impossible to tell fact from fiction in the case. It seems that there was some sort of phenomenon there, but a lot of the material that we think is potentially real is potentially added on later and has nothing to do with the original reports. We just know there was an instance of a mysterious poisoning. There was reported poltergeist activity. Most of the other parts of this tale we can almost cast aside. Now, it's interesting that the work specifically mentioning much of that additional lore happens to come around the golden age of Spiritism. That is, Ouija boards, spirit rapping, mesmerists, and mediumship and stuff like that, and ectoplasm, going to seances. Doesn't it seem that elements of that story, the more elaborated one from the late 1800s, elaborating upon a story from decades prior, isn't it very intriguing, therefore, that it happens to comport to exactly the kind of material that was specifically interesting to the late 19th century audience? I argue, and I base this partially on being, at this point, I think, relatively skilled in literary history involving the occult, I think that there was a reason for this. I think it was to market it. It is hyperbolic. It takes an initial legend, it blows it out of proportion, and presents that new material as real, sometimes borrowing from other sources that may not in all cases be known. So you got a kernel of truth, or at least historical folklore in that place, but everything else is added on. I would point out, this actually is roughly the same as something that I talked about yesterday in my occult video, which on Vermont urban legends. The Bennington Triangle, or Bennington Mountain, rather, in the general sense, is probably the best example. There have been a host of disappearances attendant to Bennington Mountain, to Glastonbury, rather. The problem is that most of them didn't happen on the mountain, and those that did are easily accounted for. Hunting accident, serial killer, predation by bear or wolf or something like that. The only particularly interesting disappearance, I guess the one with the little kid is kind of interesting, and they're thinking, I think that he might have gotten eaten by hogs, actually, if I remember correctly, which is unfortunate. There's a legend about not wearing red near the mountain, so I guess, I can't go in this robe, I have to wear the green one. The only interesting one happens on a bus. It happens considerably later than the other disappearances and doesn't even involve the mountain. It involves going through the Bennington area on a bus. I think that was in the 1970s, if I remember correctly, or 60s. That particular case is very strange. A man gets on a bus and doesn't get back off. If it weren't attendant to Glastonbury Mountain, it would be some B-movie superhero flick by now about the disappearing man or about UFO abduction. It wouldn't be about the mountain if it were just out in the middle of nowhere. So it was obviously a vanishing hitchhiker. It was just that dude must have died by the road in an accident. He gets on the bus to try to get home and disappears halfway there because he's cursed. They would have literally categorized it under an entirely different form of urban legend or mythology. This happens sometimes. Certain times, material presented with regards, especially to the spookier aspects of the paranormal, is retooled for what is considered of interest. There's another connection here. It's literally listed in connection to the Bellwitch case. The Bellwitch case is partially the backdrop against which the Blair Witch Project was made. The idea of this found footage is the early 90s. Found footage from the woods, a group of three, young adults, teens, 20-somethings, whatever, go out in the woods, and then the Blair Witch gets them. Now, it is acknowledged that it's partially based on elements of the Bell Witch legend. Once again, though, the Blair Witch success is the result of taking a classic story trope and retooling it. Well, we'll make a website for it. And it'll be found footage. So this is like VHS generation, early internet generation. We can make this spooky. And we can make a shit ton of money. I can't even imagine how much money the actors and actresses made for doing this. Got to be pretty substantial. I don't think they've ever really done anything else since then, but, you make a couple $1 million, you can rest easy for a while. The thing is that much like the initial Bellwitch story from the 1890s, this is a re-embellishment of the same basic core concept. And it's not the Bellwitch project, it's the Blair Witch Project. It only borrows slightly from it. But it's the same kind of retooling that already happened with the Bell Witch case from the initial story with the first book written about the subject, which was posthumous to most of those involved. It's very, very interesting. By the way, I'm not shitting on the idea of the Bell Farm and Adams and stuff. I'd like to go and see that particular location. I think it'd be cool. But for the historical quality. Not because I necessarily believe there was a witch living in these people's walls, sending mice out to nibble their feet at night. That's about all. Peace out.